Today, we are going to break with tradition on this channel and answer an unusually direct question. Why is the Sistine Chapel called that? The Sistine Chapel is one of the most famous, as well as culturally, politically, and religiously significant places on the planet, having possibly the most famous ceiling in the world, painted by one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It is also where the Pope lives, and for centuries now has been where the Catholic Church chooses its next Pontifex Maximus when the up until that point Holy Father departs from this mortal life. And even if you don't recognize it from the inside, you will no doubt recognize its near-legendary smoke signals, which are released as a message to the world about the progress being made to find the next Holy Father of the Catholic Church. But for such an incredibly important, incredibly significant, and often history-shaping location, the Sistine Chapel has a pretty weird name that a lot of people don't understand. And with good reason. We don't use the word Sistine to describe anything other than this world-famous chapel for most of my life, and I imagine this was the case for a lot of other people. I kind of presumed that the Sistine Chapel was just an outdated way of saying an old name of an old building, such as there were chapels number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and then finally the Sistine Chapel. Satisfied as I was with this fairly logical conclusion, I never really thought about it much beyond this. That, however, turned out to be an entirely misguided presumption. It was a belief which, in retrospect, put a lot of stock into the Catholic Church only managing to build a chapel every 73 years in the 11th centuries from Constantine the Great until the Sistine Chapel was finally built. But since the name is not an indication of the original 16 Catholic chapels, and since its name does not seem to line up with its worldwide significance of being home to the Pope and where the next Pope is selected, then what exactly does the name Sistine Chapel mean? This video will then cover the rich history that led to the construction of the Sistine Chapel, the geopolitical context in which it was built, the consequences that it would have on the world for the next 500 plus years, and finally, what sort of place the Sistine Chapel occupies in the modern world. So please sit back and relax and join me as we answer the deceptively revealing history of why the Sistine Chapel is called that. Before we explain the Sistine Chapel, though, we must first put it into a larger geopolitical context. At its most basic and fundamental level, the Sistine Chapel is a Catholic church. And more specifically than that, it is a Roman Catholic church, so that must then be the starting point in this journey. Roman Catholicism is one of the largest religions in the world, and if the Catholic Church itself is to be believed, around 1 in 6 people on the planet have been baptized to Catholicism. But as I have talked about in my previous videos, much of what we think of today as Christian tradition actually started out as Roman pagan traditions, which were co-opted by the Christian Church during the Christianization of pagan Rome. Hence the name Roman Catholicism, to distinguish it from the Roman paganism which it replaced. Over the centuries, many pagan temples in the city of Rome were converted from pagan temples into Christian churches. To take probably the most famous examples, we can take the baths of Valerius Diocletianus, which were converted into a basilica to Saint Mary, Mother of Christ. The same thing happened to the legendary Pantheon, built by the equally legendary Marcus Agrippa, which was also converted into a basilica for Saint Mary, Mother of Christ. And last but not least, the now famous, but throughout the Middle Ages notorious, Castel Saint Angelo, or Castle of the Saintly Angel, an impregnable papal fortress which served the papacy as it forced its will on the rest of Europe throughout the Middle Ages. But the Castle Saint Angelo was itself built on the ruins of Hadrianus' mausoleum, whom history recognizes in the English-speaking world as the Emperor Hadrian, who I covered in another of my previous videos. Now, this Emperor Hadrianus is perhaps more than anything defined by his building phase, where he Romanized the imperial provinces, leaving behind those ruins that you saw on your vacation that one time. And Hadrianus forever cemented his place in history with the construction of the wall that bears his name, Hadrian's Wall, which divided the Roman world from the rest of the Britannic Isles, which we learned again in my previous video on the history of beards. Now, this Roman fortification was the inspiration for the magical The Wall, where men were sent to serve out their days in that show that society is now going out of their way to pretend never happened. Now, Hadrianus also brought back beards to Rome after nearly a quarter of a millennia of clean-shaven Romans, and no other Roman commander-in-chief / emperor / high priest spent as much time away from the city of Rome, nor as much time with the Roman soldiers as the Emperor Hadrianus. And for this reason, Hadrianus also left a distinct Roman imprint on the imperial provinces, although we shouldn't take away from the fact that Hadrianus also personally oversaw the forging of the imperial legions into the entity that so inspired Edward Gibbon to write this absolute behemoth of a book, which is worth reading if you have the time, even just to admire the human achievement that it took to write. Hadrianus' Rome, I think, is fair to say, what most people picture when they think of Imperial Rome. It's because the Roman Republic and Empire are of critical importance to all of Christianity. If you watched my video on history of the calendar, you will already know this because I listed them all in full detail there. But for those who haven't seen it, spoiler alert, despite everyone knowing what it refers to, and despite being called that in the media and even official statements on official visits, there is actually no such thing as a Pope. Pope is nowhere to be found amongst the plethora of holy titles that the Holy Father holds, and he holds an overwhelming amount of titles. There is, however, such a thing as a Supreme Pontiff, which is English for the Latin term for the religious Roman office of Pontifex Maximus, which literally means greatest bridge builder, as in the one most responsible for maintaining the bridge between the heavens and the earth. It is this title that is held by the current Pope, and it is this same title that the Emperor Hadrianus held when he underwent all of his grand construction, and it was the title that he held as he built his pagan temples, which today serve as Christian churches. This matters because the Sistine Chapel is located within the theocratic city-state of the Vatican. The Vatican is the smallest, by both size and population, state in the entire world, and the Vatican, named after Mons Vaticanus on the western bank of the Tiber River, is itself located within Rome, the founding city of the Roman Kingdom, later Republic, later Empire, and, as I am sure you have already figured out now, why the Roman Catholic Church is called the Roman Catholic Church. It is therefore unsurprising that the Sistine Chapel is no exception to this rule of Christian paganism conglomeration, and this is the main reason that the popes dictate time to this very day. The Gregorian calendar, which I covered in detail in the aforementioned calendar video, is the dominant calendar in use by the majority of the human population. It was named after the calendar reforms to the previous Julian calendar, itself named after Julius Caesar, by the then Pontifex Maximus, Pope Gregorius XIII, in the year 1582 CE. Pope Gregorius decided to finally settle a debate that had been ongoing since the Council of Nicaea in the year 325 CE about how and when to date Easter every year. And it has been the Pope's responsibility, and that of those who run the Vatican with the Pope, to keep track of the first full moon after the spring equinox, which has determined which day will be designated Easter Sunday for the last 440 years. Now that we know all of that, it should come as no surprise that the origin of chapel, or sacellum as it is known in Latin, comes from Roman army camps. And it was in these Roman army camps that the so-called sacellum, or the plural sacella, was found. Sacella then being the word and origin of capella, the word for chapel in all of the non-English speaking Christian world. I have covered Roman army camps in some detail in a few of my previous videos, and if you are interested in learning more, I would encourage you to watch my old videos or subscribe and wait until I make a video dedicated entirely to them. But to give you a short summary of their important, famous Roman army camps in the modern world include the European capitals of London and Paris, the Old York, where Constantine the Great, founder of New Rome / Constantinople, and the man who converted pagan Rome to Christianity, became Caesar, and where New York draws its name from. These Roman army camps are also where the infamous emperor-murdering Praetorian Guards got their name from. And not only that, despite the United States of America only being founded several centuries after the fall of Rome, Roman army camps are still the reason that city streets in the United States are laid out on a grid format with a main street running through them, and they are also the reasons why the United States of America has a Senate, a legion, a Latin code of law, golden fasces, a golden imperial eagle, and elect a single unified commander-in-chief, whom the Romans called imperator, the root where we get the modern words emperor and empire from. The main reason that we know of their significance in the modern world is because the sacellum housed the legionary standard of the Roman legion, and these legionary standards held great religious and symbolic value to the Roman soldiers. As I covered in my video on Lupercalia and the mythical founding of Rome, in the late 2nd century BCE, Gaius Marius, the man who raised Julius Caesar after the death of Caesar the Elder, made the eagle the standard and uniform sign of all Roman legions. The Romans marched under these standards, swore oaths on these standards, and they guarded them with their very lives. The loss of a legionary standard was an incredibly shameful and traumatic event on the Roman psyche, and we know of their importance definitively due to a plethora of writers from incredibly different backgrounds with often wildly different and often directly conflicting political motives describing the sacellum and the legionary standards in the same way. The North African early Christian theologian Quintus Septimius Tertullianus, most famous for giving us the concept of the Holy Trinity, complained bitterly about this fact in his magnum opus Apologeticus. In it, Tertullianus says, when comparing the idols of Roman paganism with the simplicity and spirituality of the Holy Cross, that the religion of the Romans venerates the standards of the army camp, that the Romans swear oaths by these standards. Not only that, but that the Romans rank the legionary standards above all of their other gods. The insufferable, but indispensable for our understanding of Rome, Cassius Dio, who we can say with some certainty is about the exact polar opposite to Tertullianus, even went so far as to blame Crassus's defeat at the Battle of Carrhae on his inability to read the omens regarding the legionary standard. Dio alleges that upon crossing the Euphrates River into Mesopotamia, and thus starting an unprovoked war with the Parthians, Crassus had failed to see the signs from the gods when the legionary eagle standards would not allow themselves to be pulled from the ground, and not only that, that the legionary standards had started throwing themselves off the bridge and into the river as if they knew that they were about to walk headfirst into an absolute and colossal disaster. This institution of the legionary standard was in fact so sacred to the Romans that to them there was really no linguistic difference between army and standard, which the Romans called signa. It was therefore not the Roman army that marched all over the Mediterranean basin, but the Roman standards that did. And during the Roman civil wars, bitter clashes between two Roman armies were not described as Roman armies combating each other, but as standard against standard, equal versus equal. Probably the most defining anecdote we have of this, though, comes directly from Julius Caesar himself in his commentaries on the Gallic Wars. Upon witnessing the men of Caesar's favorite legion, Legio X Equestris, fearful of engaging the enemy of the up until that point quasi-mythical island of Britannia, according to Caesar's fantastical own narrative, the legion's eagle-bearers shamed the men into fighting by saying something along the lines of, "Follow me now, you cowards, unless you wish to see your eagle betrayed to the enemy. I, for my part, will do my sworn duty to my general and to the Republic." And with those words, he leapt from the boat and charged at the enemy. And rather than let this wild maniac do whatever he wanted, the entire army frantically followed the eagle, and thus Britannia was invaded, and the world would never be the same again. And it was in these places of pagan worship and cult-like religious ceremonies around the Cicellum that evolved into modern-day Christian chapels, which, much like the Roman army camps of old, can be found in all sizes and shapes all over the planet in the modern world. Having now established what a chapel is, we can then move on to answering the other part of the name Sistine Chapel. Because the actual name for the Sistine Chapel isn't actually the Sistine Chapel, but rather the Latin Sacellum Sixtinium, which I feel, when translated back from Latin, should not be the Sistine Chapel, but rather the Chapel of Sixtus, which I personally think makes a lot more sense and is a lot more user-friendly due to this revolutionary new idea of it actually telling you what the Sistine Chapel is, rather than just confusing you. When you pair this with the information that the Pontifex Maximus for this time period that the Sistine Chapel was built was Pope Sixtus IV, then it seems an almost disappointingly simple explanation. The Sistine Chapel being named after the guy who had it built is an interesting bit of trivia, but ultimately an unsatisfactory conclusion. But luckily for us, there is more to this story than meets the eye. Looking deeper into the history of the Sistine Chapel itself is in fact anything but simple. And its construction and the reign of Pope Sixtus IV actually serves as a pivotal moment in the history of the world that still shapes our everyday lives more than half a millennia later. So, who is Pope Sixtus IV then? To begin with, Sixtus was not his actual name, nor was he even born in the city of Rome. Nor did he know any of the previous three Sixtuses, the other three guys named Sixtus, because they all died and ruled more than 1,000 years before Sixtus IV himself was born. Sixtus IV was born in the then Republic of Genoa in modern-day Italy, and his name, prior to becoming Pontifex Maximus, was Francisco della Rovera. Theologically speaking, Sixtus was an adherent to the Franciscan order, a branch of Christianity that revered Saint Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of life-changing guitar solos. Sixtus became Pope during an era in which the Vatican had incredible influence over not just the spiritual and heavenly, but also real-life, actual political power. The Vatican had been immensely wealthy and influential for already more than 1,000 years by the time of Sixtus IV, but this had increased exponentially in value and authority after the fall of Constantinople in the year 1453. The papacy was, during this time, depending on how you view such things, either controlled with the support of aristocratic European families, or if you prefer a more cynical approach, directly controlled by these aristocratic families of Europe, with the most famous of these no doubt being, in the modern world, the Borgias, who have been the subject of films, TV shows, books, and even video games. In this era of expansionist popes that our featured guest today, Pope Sixtus IV, enters the history books. Sixtus IV is, apart from the chapel that bears his name, today mainly known for his papal bull of 1478. Now, this papal bull granted papal authority to King Ferdinand II of Aragon and his wife, Queen Isabella I of Castile, whose marriage had aligned the two major powers of the Iberian Peninsula into one house, making them the first official monarchs of the newly founded nation of Spain. But if you know your history, you will no doubt recognize this as the moment that officially started the Spanish Inquisition.
I didn't expect a kind of Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
And heralded the arrival of Spanish imperialist ambitions, which, if you are not familiar with this part of history, this era is the fundamental reason that most of South America is, number one, Catholic, number two, speaks Spanish, and number three, will ruin your day if you look too deeply into its history. Sixtus IV revived a title for the Pope which had not been in use for more than 1,000 years. His deliberate choice to link up to an ancient past, to a time where the Pontifex Maximus was an elitist political force, can be seen as no coincidence considering the entirety of his reign as Pontifex Maximus. Sixtus involved the Catholic Church in the Spanish Inquisition, the dying remnants of the Reconquista, and launched the age of Spanish imperialism in the New World, his papal dispensation for the Catholic monarchs, which is a fancy legal way of saying the Pope decreed that the king and queen should be immune from the law because God said so, would go on to irreversibly change the history of the Western Hemisphere, resulted in unfathomable human misery for decades and centuries to come. He set the stage for robber baron popes like Rodrigo de Borgia to impose papal armies, and in his own imagination, literally splitting the New World in half between the Spanish and Portuguese in the year 1492. This resulted in the deaths and enslavements of entire nations of natives in South America and became one of the cornerstones in the so-called Atlantic slave trade, which lasted from 1492 to 1898 and whose consequences can still be seen in every country Acutely aware of his upcoming place in history, Pope Sixtus underwent construction of the Sistine Chapel, which he magnanimously named after himself. He bullied one of the most talented artists of his generation / all time, the aforementioned member of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Michaelangelo, to paint him a ceiling worth remembering, which Sixtus hoped would erase everything else that he did from the collective memory. As we have now discovered, the Sistine Chapel is then named Sacellum Sixtinium after Pope Sixtus IV. A chapel is a capella, is a sacellum, which we get from Roman military camps. And the Roman Catholic Church was, in some cases quite literally, built on the ruins of Roman paganism. If you look at it in critical terms over the centuries, then the decision to revive the title and office of Pontifex Maximus looks incredibly suspicious. If we're being perfectly honest, this was an office where letting it die out and fade from memory was probably the right thing to do at the time, and the reasons for doing so haven't really changed since then. After all, this is a political office that was used to stifle social progress for centuries, where the Roman equivalent of Pope would directly interfere with election results, ban people from attending politics if they did not respect the prerogatives of the elite, and this even went so far in one infamous case that the Roman equivalent of Pope brutally murdered the Roman equivalent of a saint, who happened to be a close family member of said Pope, and hundreds of their political supporters because they wanted to feed the poor. The aforementioned Julius Caesar, whilst serving as Pontifex Maximus, committed by his own account what we in the modern world would term as genocide. It was this title that the popes revived and maintain to this very day. It was in their role as supreme religious officials that the popes inspired crusades and New World colonialism that led to indescribable human misery, death and diseases, and centuries of religious persecution and the transatlantic slave trade. The Sistine Chapel stands out as a marvel of architecture and art that feels as timeless today as it did more than half a millennium ago. But we must not separate the art and the artist from the patron nor the patronage. At its heart, the Sistine Chapel was built on the orders of a man who made the world an objectively worse place for the overwhelming majority of the people who had to live with the consequences of his decisions. And to top it all off, he went ahead and made the people most responsible for this completely immune from the law, citing divine intervention. He ushered in an era of religious persecution, forced conversion, torture, and a reign of terror, the likes of which has rarely been seen in human history. The Spanish Inquisition and the age of colonialism remain a permanent stain on humanity's conscience and a timely reminder that we must safeguard history and not let its monsters become heroes through the numbing effect of time. Though an incredible human achievement, the Sistine Chapel can never be disconnected from its contemporary role. If we must hold on to the past in the way that we do, then we must hold on to all of it. It is only through an honest confrontation of the past and a sincere reckoning with it that we can begin to learn from the past and start to right the wrongs that have been done. But at the end of the day, this is a video about the Sistine Chapel, and we must acknowledge that it does make a lot of sense for Pope Sixtus to have had the Sistine Chapel built. Because had I been known for starting the Spanish Inquisition and the countless horrors inflicted by it, and had I been so utterly corrupt to the very core of my being that for more than half a millennium after I died, I would be cited as an example of how absolute power corrupts absolutely, then I would probably also have gone out of my way to be forever remembered as pretty ceiling guy instead. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and a comment in sacrifice to Lady Algorithm. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. As I am sure you have noticed, there was an unusually long gap in between videos, but there was a very good reason for this gap. I just had a baby. And if you have ever had a baby, let alone a baby during a pandemic, you will know that having a baby does not leave you with a lot of free time to do things like edit videos. In my optimistic naivety, I believed that I could just edit with the baby on one arm or edit when the baby sleeps, but as any new parent can testify, time that you expect to have just never materializes. And I have also in the meantime released several videos in collaboration with others. And if you are interested in watching any of those videos, I will leave a link to that playlist in the description below. Other than that, I hope that you enjoyed it and learned something, and I will see you on the next one. Take care and thanks for watching.